All right, hey everyone, welcome to The Growth Project, a podcast by AMPLOS. My name is Dr. Cory Shaffer. I am joined today by Marlee Johnson. Marlee, AMPLOS's most recent, newest, and best intern. Thanks for joining me.
Glad to be here.
All right, so let's give our listeners just a little bit of background on you. We've done this in the past with everybody on the team. So let's start with just some personal stuff. I guess tell us a little bit about where you grew up, how you got to where you are.
Glad to be here. Thanks. He also only said that I'm the best intern because the only intern. But yes, my name is Marlee Johnson. I'm originally from Birmingham, Alabama, but I'm now a PhD student going to my third year at Clemson, right down the road. I am studying industrial organizational psychology and doing a little bit of work for AMPLOS as well this summer.
Awesome. So what's your background, I guess specifically, that led you to pursue as much education as it takes to get a couple of graduate degrees in IO Psych? What led you to that?
I think it stems from this just really deep love for teams and the team experience. I played volleyball starting when I was 9 years old. Played all the way through college, and throughout that time had some really, really awesome team experiences and some maybe not so awesome team experiences. And toward the end of college, just upon reflection, I think I had this moment of, wow, those really good team experiences taught me so much and set me up so well for life. Gave me awesome friends that will challenge me and be there for me forever, but then also taught me all these life lessons, like how to have good conflict, how to collaborate with people to solve a problem, how to snap back from failure, and countless other things. And I also looked back at some of those not so great experiences and realized a lot of those times maybe did the opposite, made me feel less confident in who I was, made a lot of my teammates struggle a little bit with mental health, sometimes physical health too. And just coming out of school really wanting people to have good team experiences that set them up well, and seeing team as an opportunity to help people thrive. So I guess pursuing grad school was really this question of for me at the time, it was a leadership problem. How do we equip leaders to build teams where the team can perform really well, but people also thrive within them. But then, as I've gotten into grad school, that's kind of brought into, okay, how do we as leaders and just normal team members, how do we build teams where everybody's supported and we're going after something really big that we couldn't do on our own? So that's really where it started. And yeah, now I'm doing a bunch of work in the team and leadership space.
Yeah, I've heard you use the term, and this is actually new to me, like team science or team sciences. Yeah, so I guess I'm just curious, how did all of those questions that you had, and based off of your experiences in volleyball, what led you to, or why was IO Psych the best pathway to go?
Yeah, so I thought literally up until the week that I said yes to going to Clemson, I thought that I wanted to be a sports psychologist, wanting to help people perform well and, support their well-being. And I thought that the best route for that for me would be sports psych. And at the last minute, I was kind of like, wait, teams are all over the place. It's not just sports. Maybe the interest is more in teams. So I did a bunch of research and ended up stumbling into my advisor's work, Marissa Shaffer. She's awesome and does a lot of work in this team science space, which is not just IO, but it's everything. But IO seemed at the time the broadest thing. And a lot of the team science stuff in the IO world had to do with high performance environments like military or, astronauts going to space, or even sports sometimes, but then also just normal organizations. So it felt like it had a big reach for all people.
Yeah. Yeah. And I guess that sort of leads into the next question I was going to ask, and you can expand on this, but entering into year 3, I'm assuming your perspective on what you thought this was when you got there to what it is now has probably increased quite a bit. So that perspective just on teams maybe in general, or that field of IO Psych, how has that maybe shifted or changed in the past couple of years?
Yeah, we were talking about this earlier. A lot of people do kind of shift paths once they get to grad school, and I do feel like I've doubled down in this interest, but I said, at first I thought it was an issue of leadership, and I still think that that's true. But I've also come to realize that team members make the experience. It's important to be a good follower. It's important to be a good teammate. This idea of leading up and being able to speak up and take action and be active, even if you're not necessarily in a position of leadership. I think just the understanding that the team as a unit as a whole is something that can be developed and is dynamic and changing. And it's not really just on the leader to make that a positive space that's effective.
Has I guess some of the education, the discussion, like just the whole experience of grad school, has it gone back and clarified a lot of things for you when you look back at, I guess, especially your athletic career? Or like it helped explain some of what happened or why it happened when you look back at, as you said, some really good team experiences, some really bad team experiences?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the more I've gotten into it, yes, there have been some answers. I think now I may have more questions than I had
Sure.
before. But I do think now we talk about this a lot in our lab, how it's sometimes annoying to study teams because they're everywhere. Like everything can be a team. And so now that's what I see is team processes. And that's always what my eyes jump to. And I think being able to look back and know, well, that was an issue of like expectations. It wasn't their character or anything against me. It was just expectations weren't clear, or my role wasn't clear quite yet, or we weren't necessarily bad. We just didn't capitalize on this team learning process that sometimes makes us not perform so well at first, and then you grow. Just different things, being able to recognize what it is and see teamwork more as a skill rather than pinning some of the problems on the people.
Yeah. And the reason I asked that question is that was my experience in going in the sports psychology route. Was I felt like it helped fill in a bunch of gaps and clarify my own experiences as like an athlete. But then similarly, it was more questions then, so it's interesting to hear your answer there. Okay. So we'll get, I guess, more specifically to your research here in a minute. Why don't you spend a minute just, I guess, helping our listeners understand a little bit about what you do here with us at AMPLOS and what you've done so far. I know we're still relatively in the beginning stages of this, but what does that look like?
Yeah, I think it looks like a lot of different things, but mostly brought in to help a little bit with some assessment, evaluation type stuff, being able to demonstrate people's growth and what impact like our programs are having for people. We've recently been helping out with some content alignment and making sure everything flows smooth, and then kind of just have my hand in wherever I can learn and people need help.
Yeah, gotcha. Okay, cool. All right, well, let's shift to your research, which will probably be the bulk of this conversation. Where do you want to begin there? What makes sense to start just with kind of the initial questions, and sort of walk us through how we got from there to where you are now. You take the lead here.
Like I said, that first question, how do we equip leaders to build high-performing teams? I think the thing that stuck is like high-performance teams, and the piece of that I didn't really know is I'm really interested in these perform at all costs, high-stakes environments. So military, like I said, astronaut flight teams, healthcare teams, and, maybe I'm a little biased, but sports teams I love as well, specifically college sports. So it started off, came to Clemson, was pulled into a few projects early on, mostly dealing with the military. And then now that's kind of shifted, I started working on my master's thesis a couple years ago, which is when we first met. Mm-hmm. And that was on college sports teams. And it was when all of the NIL transfer portal stuff was really ramping up, which had been happening kind of all throughout my college career as well when I was playing. And kind of at the same time, there was this big push to better support student-athlete mental health. And that's always been there, but I feel like, I was there 2018 to 2022 playing college sports, and there was just a really big cry during the COVID era for support student-athletes. And yeah, that left me with a lot of questions about, okay, how do we think about sports from this more IO lens? Are student athletes about to be employees? What does that mean for how we build teams? A lot of coaches were asking questions of, well, how are we going to get people to stay on our teams? and not transfer universities. And so that was kind of where thesis came from, and that's been the project I've focused mostly on the past 2 years. And just the main question there, asking this idea of how do we build a sticky culture other than what has to do with money, because NIL is in the picture, but what is an actionable thing that coaches can do to make people want to stay where they are, be proud of what they're building.
Right. So let's go there, and maybe you can tell us a little bit more about, I guess, the method behind the study, and specifically like what you're looking at and how you've gone about studying it.
Do different team dynamics, specifically perceptions of student athletes, their perceptions of their team. How does that impact whether or not they want to leave their team? Because if we can show that how people perceive their team dynamics and where they are kind of located in the team, we can show that that has an impact on whether or not they're thinking about leaving, then those are actionable things we can do to develop the team culture. So the process behind that, at first it started off very researchy, and then kind of figured out, I work with another girl, Allie Wentworth, pretty closely on this, and we kind of realized we had this opportunity to also kind of give feedback to coaches during the process. So we have surveys, they include a bunch of different team dynamics, they do it at multiple points throughout the year. And yes, it's for our research, but I do think the coolest part is we generate these reports. And it's kind of the idea is, you can walk into a weight room and you can see how any player is functioning, what are they squatting, how fast are they running, that type of thing at any given point in time. We don't have anything like that for teamwork or for team dynamics or for how people they're feeling about the team. So it's kind of this pilot idea we're able to give back our coaches. Here's a snapshot of what people are feeling about your team right now. Here's some evidence-based recommendations for what you might want to do to improve or capitalize on some of your strengths. And that's been really fun, just getting to know coaches, getting to know different teams' needs and different sports, ways to address different stuff like that.
Can you give us some specifics in terms of like the dynamics that you're talking about, like some of the specific things you're measuring or the questions?
So looking into things like safety, aspects of team culture, like role clarity, supportive, they say supportive management, but really supportive coaching.
What are some of the things that you've seen? Are there any trends or themes? Is that something you're safe to talk about at this point?
We definitely got some stuff that's still in the works. I think kind of preliminarily, one thing that is just important with teams in general is role clarity. Mm-hmm. We've talked about that quite a bit. But just, I think I've really understood with this, like how important role clarity is, how important it is for people to understand why do they fit into the team? How are they helping the team accomplish their mission? How do I fit into this broader thing with other people? Is so important for just how people feel about their team experience, and then also, are they performing well? Do they want to stay? So I think just underscoring what I already, what research has said is really important. People know their role, but it's just made it really apparent to me.
Yeah. Well, and I was going to ask about that. Like, what is the broader research showing? Because I'm assuming this is probably like one of the first studies or the first study ever to really take this kind of a deep dive, especially in this era of college sports, correct?
Yes, for sure. It's been, I can't find too much out there on even, what are the reasons for people transferring with all the changes, because there are so many other factors at play.
Yeah. So what's the broader research showing then?
Broader research on sports,
all the things that you're measuring, all the things you're looking at, whether it's if there is any information in sports, but even into organizational stuff, what do you see in there?
Lots in organizations. There's a lot of the inspiration of this kind of came from turnover in nursing teams, because turnover has been such an issue in recent years, burnout. But lots of similar things, just, role clarity, setting good expectations, people feeling safe to speak up, take risks, do the things that they're good at. Very similar results in other spaces. It's a unique context because, NIL makes money a meaningful thing.
Yeah.
And it hasn't always been. But definitely other organizations have thought about, it's called intention to leave in other spaces.
Right. So essentially what you're looking for is, are there some things that coaches can do to potentially offset the money factor?
Yes.
right? So like, hey, I understand that I have this great player who probably knows and is very mindful that he can enter the transfer portal and go make, 6 figures somewhere. But I want to have a compelling enough culture internally that they don't want to leave.
Right.
That's sort of the idea, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. Which is just fascinating. So I guess so far through the research, all the different projects you've been engaged in, like what are some of your takeaways? Like what can our listeners maybe hear and think about, or if they're in a leadership role especially, or like you said, I think all of this applies to just every team member, but what are some things you would point out?
So I think the first thing, just teamwork is a skill. It's something that can be trained and taught and we can get better at. It's not necessarily the case that you've been on a team at one point in your life and you're really, really good at teamwork. That's not necessarily how it works. So I think just knowing that it's something trainable, that it's not teams that are bad if you've had a bad experience. It's just there are good ways to be to team, and there are not so good ways, and we can train and practice at getting better at being teammates. And I think if you're a leader, like setting your team up really well to team well, giving them the structure to do it. So, casting, we talk about vision and values a lot here. So casting vision, setting clear expectations about what people are supposed to be doing, that role clarity piece, and continuing to have those conversations about, what are your strengths? How do I see you bringing them to the table? And then putting people in positions where they're empowered to actually act on that. And, encouraging people to step up, think out of the box, and really capitalize on the things that make them unique within the team and help people contribute.
Yeah. Well, let's talk for a second, like specifically leader. What's the responsibility of a leader in creating a high-performing team?
Yeah, so the leader sets the tone in a lot of ways. I think depending on the context you're talking about, that the answer to that question changes. But I think in a lot of spaces, it's about knowing your people, building the relationships that allow you to know what makes your people tick, and so that you can encourage them to do what they're good at and to contribute to the team in the way that they were brought on to do. I also think building safe spaces, this psych safety culture, I think the leader sets the tone for that as well. Just, encouraging people to have a voice, to speak up, to say when they see things that are going wrong, to share their ideas. I think, psych safety is really important for team learning, and teams do evolve over time. They are an entity that does learn and change. So that's a key factor for high performance in the long run.
Well, you can expand on that a little bit. We've certainly talked about psych safety in the past, but I feel like we're always getting new listeners and so on. So how do you define psych safety? Let's start there.
Yeah, so psych safety is it's a piece of team climate. So if we think about team culture as kind of the vibe on a team over the long haul, climate is like a snapshot of what it is. So how do team members feel in a given moment about their team, and about how they can interact with their team? And psych safety is a specific piece of team climate where the team members believe that it's safe to take interpersonal risks without fear of repercussion. So I feel like I can speak up. I can take risks that might lead to mistakes. I can say something that may not be so fun to say something to somebody else, and they're going to receive it well because they know that this is a safe space and we all have the best intention. We're all going for the same goal.
Gotcha. And so with that in mind, we had an interesting conversation earlier today even about the psych safety piece, something that you had recently learned, and I feel like this is probably the appropriate time. We can just talk a little bit more about that. But I think you mentioned like it's one thing for leaders to essentially act in a way or be vulnerable enough that their team members feel like there's a pretty low cost to hear their voice heard, correct?
Yeah.
But what's the other piece of that you mentioned?
So the other piece of that is, it's not just lowering the cost, it's raising the stakes of not speaking up. And I think Amy Edmondson, if you don't know, she's the one that coined psych safety, and I was listening to her speak at a conference this weekend, and she made the point that a lot of people think psych safety, or at least developing it from a leader standpoint, is all about lowering those costs and making people feel like there won't be repercussions for it. But sometimes the pushback with psych safety is, well, if we lower those costs, then how are people ever going to be held accountable? And I think that's where it comes back to the purpose of psych safety is to learn, and you need accountability for that. And that's where those raising the stakes of not speaking up comes up.
And so, yeah, share like the example that we had talked about earlier, and maybe Edmonton discussed at the conference, but I thought that was a really good way, probably for our listeners even, to make sense of what we're talking about here. So share that.
Yeah. So Amy Edmonton does a lot of work in healthcare surgical teams. And so the idea here was, a nurse watching a surgery or involved in a surgery needs to be able to speak up if, let's say, something gets left in a body. And they're about to sew a person up, they need to know that, and they need to feel safe enough to speak up. But it's not just the costs are low if I speak up. Like, that's a life or death situation where the stakes of not speaking up need to be really high. Mm-hmm. And it comes from the leader, or the doctor in this case, kind of setting the tone on the front end. She calls it inclusive leadership, but acknowledging like, hey, I'm a fallible human and I want y'all to give me input, and just setting the tone, laying the land, that I am going to listen to y'all's feedback, and actually I really need your feedback. It's really important, and I think in all spaces, but especially in those contexts where it could be life or death.
Yeah, and that's what we had some dialogue about, which, again, we were in agreement. Like, it kind of makes sense in that setting, right? Like, yeah, the costs are really high to me not speaking up here, and so you're probably going to get people who are willing to speak up because you literally are dealing with life and death situations. Probably different, though, for your sort of standard, office culture or organization where it's not quite life and death.
Right.
Did you have any ideas on what this could look like, or, an example of what this would be in sort of those settings?
Yeah, this is the tough question I came to you with earlier. I think we talked a lot about this too, but just relationships, knowing what makes your people tick and putting them in positions where they're going to be motivated to speak up because it matters to them to speak up, and hold others accountable. And
you mentioned it kind of from the start, right? It's one thing to get the psych safety right. The other thing you mentioned, though, was just like leaders knowing their people. Right. And so if you think about just the combination of those things, if I really understand you well, like, you need some skin in the game. Right. That's the point, is right. You need some skin in the game if you're going to speak up and feel like it really matters to speak up. Like, you want to win just as badly as I want to win.
Right.
That's the point. But unless I really know what's going to drive you and what's going to at least even give you the perception that you have some skin in the game, I really have to understand you.
Yeah, absolutely.
So as simple as it sounds, it goes back to like your very first point, which was you kind of just have to get to know your people.
Yeah.
Is that something, though, I guess, I'm not sure if there's literature on this or maybe just your observation in some of the settings you've been. What's your take on how leaders do with that? Like, are they doing a good enough job of getting to know their people? Is there sort of a continuum of that you've seen? What's your observation there?
Yeah, I know there is literature on this. I'm not super well versed in it. But there's one paper, and I'm not even going to try to explain it, but it kind of reminds me of this. The more distance there is between the leader and the team, yep. So the higher you go up, the harder it is to keep those relationships. And the more important it is that you have people that are close to you that can be the kind of the bridge between leadership and team. And when you don't have that, you're pretty far removed. And I think something that I hear all the time kind of in team space is like, stay close to the ground for as long as you can. Be in the action. If you're leading a manufacturing company and you're in the C-suite, you're in an office, take the time to go say hi to people, ask them how they're doing, ask them about their kids, go walk around the floor for a while. Same thing goes, but it gets harder the higher you get up because you have more responsibilities, more people to tune to. And so that's where like leadership development comes in handy, of having, take care of the next team down and they're taking care of those people. But as much as you can, just spending time with people. And honestly, time is really hard and you have to really intentionally prioritize it.
Yeah. And so I was curious, based on the anecdotal stuff, having spent time in the space, or that's the research piece. My anecdotal piece would fit with exactly what you just said. Like, that's usually the disconnect, is leadership is almost like too far removed from the day to day of the people that we're talking about, right? The teams that they're supposed to be leading, and there comes the issue, you know?
Yeah.
And that's, I think, what I've unfortunately seen. I think you sprinkle in at this point, oftentimes like geographic regions, hybrid or remote work environments, like all of that becomes a real challenge for leaders to really kind of just keep the pulse on people and teams. And so that's one of the things that ends up lacking. So even if they're creating a psychologically safe environment, what they may not be doing is be attuned enough with people to really help them feel like they have some skin in the game. Right. To really, like you said, the cost is high enough if I don't speak up and offer my opinion or my insights or my observations and so on.
Yeah. And just like being able to know them well enough to put people in a position where they can thrive and be who they are and like authentically work really hard and enjoy it. Because a lot of times when we find something meaningful, we're going to speak up, we're going to be really productive, but we're also going to find joy in it. And I think that's another really important piece of this is, when you're working with other people and doing things that you enjoy and or doing things that you love, you find a lot of joy in it.
Yeah. So one final piece I want to talk about, unprepared for here. So we're going to go off the cuff, which is okay. But we were talking earlier, and this is all stuff that I'm sure you're pretty well versed in. We talked earlier about communication. And the reason I want to bring this up is this is, I think, relevant to every single person who's tuning in here, regardless of what role you're in or industry you're in, because communication impacts all of us. What are just a couple of the high points that you've learned about and think are important in terms of creating a high performing team? Or the teams that work really well together? You said you can do teaming well or poorly, right? So the teams that are doing well, what does communication look like?
So I think two things. One is this quality over quantity thing. I think there are not many things that are more annoying to a lot of people than just pointless chatter all the time just to speak and say something in a group. The meetings that are like, we didn't really need to have this. This could have been an email. It can be very frustrating and annoying. But when there's quality communication that's actually advancing what we're doing together and is useful, I think that can make for really effective team functioning. Making sure that you know who needs to be looped in, and saying the right things, but very, direct, succinct things that are not pointless, but are moving us in the right direction. Time and a place for sure for that more relational, not so outcome oriented talk. But I think in the process of going after something big, just cut the pointless chatter and focus on having quality conversations.
So quality over quantity. And I liked what you said there too. The qualifier, I think you said really well, like advancing what we're doing. I think that's a really, really good way of thinking about it. It's like a football team. Like you wouldn't run a play that didn't have a purpose.
Right.
Like the point is to advance the ball down the field. So yes, I like that language. So I get that piece, quality over quantity. What's the other piece?
Closed loop communication, which we talked about, but just when somebody says something, just checking back in of like, hey, I heard this. Did I understand it? And they say yes or no. I think we missed that second piece of asking, did I understand this? We assume that we're always on the same page just because we're talking. And a lot of times we're not. We have different definitions, ideas of things. And if we would just take that extra second to check back in, a lot of errors would be caught and we'd all be on the more on the same page, which is just really important for not just teamwork, but I think all kinds of work if you're working with others. Yeah,
and that probably influences even some of the things we've already talked about here, like role clarity. How often it's just like one generic email is sent out to a team of people, but there's not a ton of clarity in terms of like who's doing what or exactly what's expected. And what's worse then is nobody on the receiving end of that like responds back and says, hey, let me get some clarity. What I heard was this.
Right.
So again, the point is it remains open-ended, right? Like we haven't actually closed the loop on the communication. We by definition, we are not on the same page.
Right.
Right. Like that's the point I think behind the closed loop piece is what it does is it ensures that we're not just on the same page. We're on the same paragraph on the same sentence.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
So yeah, I was just curious about that. I think that's always something that, our listeners, I'm sure, are going to be mindful of, thinking about. I think this, like I said, communication impacts everybody, particularly if you're in a leadership role. I think, at least in my opinion, it's the leader's responsibility to sort of set the tone for what communication is going to look like for us, right?
Yeah.
Like they're sort of responsible for setting that tone within the culture, establishing the climate. One of the things that I'll actually give a shout out here to a guy who I know listens to the podcast. So Coach Mike Noonan at Clemson, the men's soccer coach. Coach, what's up? He actually does a really fantastic job every year during preseason meetings with his team. Okay, so again, a new team every year, right? Because you have new people coming, you have people going, right? The dynamics are sort of always changing, but the hierarchy of communication within the program never changes. And so he sets a tone of, this is how within our program we are going to communicate, and number one will always be face-to-face communication.
Yep.
And think about how impactful that is, even for what we're talking about, like with closed loop, right? Is like when you're face-to-face with somebody, it's a whole lot easier. Even if I'm the one who's saying something to you, I can see in your face, like it didn't register. Like
Right.
You don't understand what I'm saying. So you go, hey, did that make sense? And now you're at least opening the door for the person to go, like, you know what? No, it doesn't.
Right.
Can you explain that again? Right. But face-to-face communication followed by, a phone call where you can actually speak to somebody and hear their voice, then getting into, text message, email, and so on.
Yes.
Right. But I think that's often missed within organizations too, is there just become, 10 different ways that we communicate, and all of it is now just open-ended and just gets mixed together. If you think about email, text message, phone call, face-to-face, Teams, Slack, like all these different places where teams in an office setting are communicating, it just gets messy. It's hard.
Yeah, definitely.
So I was curious to just a little bit there on the research and how that might impact some of the team stuff. So I appreciate your time, Marlee, and I'm sure this will not be the last time you join us on the Growth Project, but really good stuff. You're doing great work for us. I think you're only going to continue to make us better. I'm excited to see what you can officially learn and share from the thesis. Some point, I'm sure you don't want to think about, but a dissertation, and so on. So thank you for your time, and thanks to our listeners. We'll see you next time on the Growth Project.